welcome to Arbitration Acumen, a podcast from Bracewell's International Arbitration Group that connects in-house counsel and arbitration practitioners with industry experts, institutional insiders, and top arbitrators from around the globe to share their views on key issues in arbitration today. You can reach out to any of today's speakers by emailing arbitrationacumen@bracewell.com. And we hope you enjoy this episode of Arbitration Acumen.
Welcome back to the next episode of Arbitral Acumen, in which we'll discuss the Dubai International Arbitration Centre, colloquially known as the DIAC, with Robert Stephen, who is the DIAC's registrar. I'm JP Duffy. I'm an international arbitration partner at Bracewell based in New York that acts as both counsel and arbitrator in international arbitration seated around the world under a variety of governing laws and arbitral rules. I'm qualified in New York, England, and Wales, and the DIFC courts in Dubai, where I previously practiced. And I've had the good fortune to be listed on the DIAC arbitrator roster since 2022. With me today is Robert Stephen. Robert is a highly regarded international arbitration practitioner that's been based in the UAE since 2011. Prior to being based in the UAE, Robert practiced in London, Paris, and the Moscow offices of a large international law firm. Before joining the DIAC, Robert was the registrar for the Dubai Financial Services Authority Financial Markets Tribunal, as well as for the DIFC LCIA Arbitration Centre, which was absorbed by the DIAC in 2022. In his role at the DIAC, Robert oversees the day-to-day functions and manages the organization. So as you can tell, we have a great guest today that can offer a wealth of knowledge about the DIAC and its current initiatives. But before we hear from Robert, I just want to give some very short background information about the DIAC for those audience members around the world that might be less familiar. The DIAC is an independent, non-governmental, not-for-profit organization and is the largest ADR center in the MENA region. It was created in 1994 by the Dubai Chamber of Commerce and Industry and was initially called the Commercial Conciliation and Arbitration Centre. In 2004, it was renamed the Dubai International Arbitration Centre, and in 2021, it was restructured and removed from the ambit of the Dubai Chambers. Following the restructuring, the DIAC now has a three-tiered structure comprised of a board of directors, an arbitration court, and an administrative body. The DIAC has administered almost 5,000 cases since its inception, with a total disputed value of $21.8 billion. The DIAC has continued to evolve over the years, and in 2022, it introduced new rules, which we'll hear more about from Robert in a few moments. So with that, let me turn to Robert. Robert, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you very much, JP. Look, it's a pleasure to be with you today and to have some time with the Arbitration Acumen audience.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you here. It's really wonderful to hear from you. So let's talk a bit about the DIAC's caseload in 2024. Let's start there. How many cases did the DIAC administer in 2024?
So I'm going to be very lawyerly about this and fudge it a little bit, but there is method in my madness. So as I think you said in your introduction, we've had 3 decades of experience of providing dispute resolution services to parties doing business in and through the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. And we are the region's largest and only truly independent arbitral institution. And over the last 5 years, our administered arbitrations have steadily increased. And we've attributed that to an increased interest across the board, I think, in the centre, but also in the region as a place for parties to resolve their commercial disputes. I'm in a slightly difficult position with regard to our 2024 statistics because at the time of recording this, they've been, of course, reported internally, but not quite yet made public. But what I can say is that our performance in 2024 was strong and that our caseload was similar in shape and size to an institution like the LCA. But probably to give you a better idea, to put that into perspective, I can say something about our caseload in 2023, which was published in our annual report. And in 2023, we registered a total of 355 cases, and that was up from 340 cases the year prior. And that represented an increase of about 4.4%. And these 340 cases broke down as 323 arbitrations, administered arbitrations under the DIAC rules, which was up from 292 the year prior, and represented an increase of about 11%. One mediation, having launched DIAC mediation rules on the 1st of October 2023, and then 31 cases where we accepted a mandate to act as an appointing authority, either in an ad hoc case that was proceeding under the UAE Federal Arbitration Law, where the parties had agreed, or in a case that was proceeding under the International Arbitration Rules.
Well, that certainly is impressive growth. And I think the fact that the 2024 statistics will be coming out later gives me a good opportunity to say that we'll certainly have to have you back later in the year or early next to discuss those statistics. But the growth in 2023, if it's any indication of 2024, is impressive. Now, how many of those cases were international?
So I think, the caseload of the centre is increasingly international. And I think in 2024, I can say a little bit about the statistics in 2024 without going into the details. But in 2024, I think it's probably fair to say a little more than half of the administered arbitrations registered with the centre were international in nature. And look, how we and other institutions define international is a matter for debate. And what we do is we look at the nationality of the parties and the underlying transaction or the deal to make that assessment. And of course, it can be a little complicated in this part of the world where entities have a local partner or a sponsor and ownership can be a little bit opaque. But we are doing a far better job today than perhaps in the past at assessing whether our case is domestic or international. And so I think if we had had this conversation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have looked at the centre and you'd have said it's a very domestic centre. It's largely serving parties from the United Arab Emirates. But I think that really isn't the case today, in part because of interest internationally, but also because we've become far more sophisticated in how we assess the caseload of the centre. And the reality is that many of those parties that would have been historically marked down as a UAE party are actually an international party, just with a local branch entity that's been established here.
Well, I think that is a very interesting point because oftentimes, while it may look like a local party, as you say, it is the local entity of a much larger international organization. So I would suspect that behind those cases are a huge number of international parties, as you say. And certainly the development of the center as well and the development of arbitration in the region is contributing to that, I would imagine, as well. Now, just in that vein, then, what countries of the international cases that are out there were the top 5 users in 2023 and 2024, if you can share that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the last 3 years have been quite interesting from my perspective to look at the case of the centre, because I think there has been a significant change. And I think that's because there has been far more interest in the region than before, in part because of geopolitics, in part because of troubles in some jurisdictions, in part because business is being done in a different way. But consistently for the past 3 years, we've seen Saudi parties as being the second largest user of the centre's services. We've also seen marked increases from India, China, and Russia, which I think reflects the geopolitical comment that I just made. And of course, parties from the UK, from the US and Western Europe have been and still are regular users of the centre, and they'll always make up a significant proportion of the caseload. The caseload of the centre largely follows the trade in and through the region. So from west to east through United Arab Emirates, from east to west and north and south through United Arab Emirates. And so we're in a convenient location, not only for the movement of people, the movement of goods, movement of money, and also for the resolution of disputes. And our caseload is increasingly reflecting that.
That's really interesting. And I think, that's one thing for the audience to keep in mind is the UAE is really ideally centered between East and West to act as a central point for a lot of these disputes. And when you see the capital flows moving both from East Asia into the region and from Western Europe and the United States into the region, and then also from the region out to other areas like Africa, India, it's a two-way street at this point. So it's unsurprising to me that the DIAC would be seeing that level of international interest, particularly from those countries. Now, one thing that I think might be interesting for people less familiar with the region to understand is what percentage of cases each year are conducted in English, because obviously that is not the native language of the UAE, and I think some people probably don't appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. And look, I have a multilingual case management team. I think collectively we can speak 16 different languages, and most of our cases are administered in English. I think the reality is that from one year to next, it's somewhere between 95 and 98%. And having an experienced linguist is undoubtedly important to us, but the reality is that, as you know, as well as many of your audience do, commercial contracts are generally the world over written in English. And so the disputes that we handle are largely in English. But we have the capability to work in 16 different languages. We've got a very skilled Arabic team or division. And the way we manage the casework team is we split everyone up into groups or teams, and they largely have a language focus. So we've got a Latin team, we've got a Northern European team, we've got an Eastern European team, we've got an Arabic speaking team. So we tend to do that for convenience, but the reality is the vast majority of our disputes are in English.
Interesting. Now, you just mentioned a Latin team. Robert, are you seeing cases come out of Latin America or cases that involve Latin American parties?
We have, and particularly for investments and projects in Saudi Arabia. So there's a huge amount of investment and projects in the kingdom, and a lot of those projects are using resources from outside of the region historically. So lots of corporates from Asia, from China, from Korea are going in, but also lots of corporates from Western Europe and Latin America are going in and helping to build the huge infrastructure and development projects that are ongoing there. So there's definitely an interest, and as part of that, a recognition of that, we have had our rules translated into Portuguese and into Spanish as a priority. So the rules are available in English and Arabic, but they're also available in Spanish, Portuguese, French, Chinese, and Russian, with I think further 5 languages to come later on this year. We prioritized the first group of 5 languages on the basis that they reflected where we saw the most interest from outside.
Well, that certainly is a very strong indication of how international the caseload is then. And it also reflects the international nature of business in the region. Now, let me just turn then to a quick question that's related to that, which is you mentioned, for instance, infrastructure projects in the kingdom, in Saudi, which is obviously a very important economic driver in the region. Are there market segments from which the DIAC is seeing more cases come than others?
Well, I think there has been a shift. So I think if we had this conversation 5 years ago, you'd have said that the institutions like DIAC in the region are largely focused on infrastructure and construction disputes, which reflected at that time largely what was happening, perhaps with sprinkling of energy disputes from time to time, but probably the vast majority of those are going to other institutions in Western Europe. The reality today is slightly different. So the caseload has changed, and I would say that infrastructure and construction disputes probably make up somewhere in the region of 25 to 35% of our caseload in any given year. It does go up and down, but of course, as a generalization, that's a good place to put it. And then if we look at kind of other industries and sectors that are of interest and where we've seen some real growth, we've seen banking and finance disputes and quite a number of crypto disputes come through the door over the course of the last year to 18 months. Undoubtedly energy, but there's also transportation and logistics disputes, and tied to that, the shipment of oil from Russia to other places, including Latin America, including India. We're also seeing manufacturing and industrial cases, technology and telecommunications, professional services, hospitality, leisure, health and pharmaceuticals, all sorts of sectors. I think that really kind of is what we're seeing in terms of the major growth areas for Dubai, but also the wider region. All of these sectors have grown quite dramatically over the course of the last 5-year period, and disputes have naturally occurred and started to come through the door of the centre.
Interesting. Yeah, that certainly is a very interesting shift, because 10 years ago, and as you say, even 5 years ago, I think the vast majority of disputes would have been infrastructure. So it's great to hear that there's more diversity amongst the caseload profile that the DIAC is seeing. Now, with that, are there specific market segments then that DIAC is targeting for international cases going forward, or are there particular industries that you'd like to see more of at the DIAC?
Look, undoubtedly, we would love to diversify the caseload as much as possible, and that's diversity in all manner of respects, from the sectors and industries of disputes to the jurisdictions in which parties are based, the seats, the languages, the laws. All of those things are important as the institution matures in its 30th year. And we have a goal or an aim of being a leading arbitral institution and a top 5 arbitral institution within a relatively short period of time. And so all of that's part and parcel of that. But in terms of international cases and where we see those coming, I think it's unsurprising that we would see significant future potential from the African continent, from China, from India, and from Russia and former CIS. So those are the regions, countries that we will undoubtedly be focusing on for the foreseeable future. And I think it's the industries and the sectors that are relevant to those jurisdictions that will naturally have some focus.
Got it. So more looking at the regions and then the industries that would be associated with those regions than necessarily industries themselves.
Exactly.
Great. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the DIAC arbitration rules, because in 2022, the DIAC issued new arbitration rules that came into effect on 21 March of that year, and those supplanted the prior 2007 rules. Now, the 2022 rules incorporate global best practices and help ensure that proceedings are conducted fairly and efficiently. And notably, the 2022 rules were also drafted and approved in English, but then translated to Arabic, which is a very interesting outlook in my view. What are some of the salient features of those rules, Robert?
So yes, the 22 rules have been greatly received, and I think it's fair to say for anyone that practiced in and through the region for a long time were much awaited after lots of discussion and consultation with the wider market. And like every major arbitral institution, we're always very careful about making changes to our rules, and you don't want to do it too often, but I think such a long period of time was probably too long, and making those changes in 2022 was much needed. But the rules were all for the better and essentially made the institution more international in its outlook, and the rules better reflect what was and is today best practice from an arbitral institutional perspective for disputes and for commercial disputes. And so what we've done is we've introduced default seat provisions that provide for a default seat in the Dubai International Financial Centre in circumstances where parties have not or cannot agree on a seat. And so pending a determination by the tribunal, the parties will now have a DIFC seat for their arbitration. And that is a good thing because it gives parties access to the DIFC courts. And for those in the audience that don't know about the DIFC is a semi-autonomous free zone in Dubai and has its own common law legal system and a court system. And that court is staffed by very experienced judges from England and Wales and from other common law jurisdictions around the world. And it's a very credible court. And so to have that court as the court that supervises disputes under the rules is a good thing. In addition to that, there's been a number of changes to make the rules reflect the way proceedings are now done in a post-COVID world. So we've introduced provisions that make it very clear that proceedings can be conducted virtually, that witness evidence can be heard virtually, and that tribunals can sign awards electronically and issue those with party consent. And so that's a big change. We've also introduced provisions on third-party funding just to provide some clarity there and to ensure that if parties are being third-party funded, that is declared soon and early to ensure that we clear conflicts with the tribunal and everyone is aware of the funding arrangement right at the outset. So that's a positive change because I think the region has seen an increasing interest in third-party funding. I wouldn't say it's as popular as it is in the US or in Western Europe, but it is increasingly something that parties to disputes are looking at. And so it was important to add that. And then, of course, I think the key changes from the market's perspective were the introduction of the expedited provisions and the emergency arbitrator provisions. They were the key changes, I think, for parties and really brought the rules up to the same standard that you would expect of other leading institutions.
Well, let's talk for a moment then, Robert, about the expedited rules and the emergency rules, because those are really important additions to the 2022 rules. And let's start with the expedited rules. What are the monetary thresholds for an expedited case under the 2022 rules?
So I think uniquely amongst the leading arbitral institutions, the threshold's actually quite low. So the threshold's 1 million dirhams, which is about 270,000 US dollars. And I think it was set deliberately low to assess the interest in the expedited rules, because the way they have been introduced is that they're mandatory for disputes that arise out of contracts that are entered into after the 2022 rules were launched and issued. And so after that 22nd of March 22 date. And so they're mandatory unless the parties agree otherwise. And they're optional for those parties that have disputes arising out of contracts that were entered into before that. And so I think it was a matter of testing the water to see how many cases fell within that category and how many parties would like to opt in to use it. And what we found in the initial period, and this is a difficult one to give you any real meaningful statistics on because it's so soon after the launch. And so the numbers are still relatively small. But what we saw anecdotally was that parties were not willingly opting into the process. And this could be just a regional attitude, but they were not willingly agreeing and opting into it. And it was only those cases where parties had entered into contracts after the rules had come into play, where they were essentially forced to use them, were we seeing any cases. And that was quite interesting from our perspective. And so we have had a bit of a debate internally about whether we do need to increase the threshold to something closer to $1 million to bring in more cases into that process. But it really is interesting to see the different attitudes from one region to the next to expedited proceedings, because when everyone agrees to it and everyone buys into it and you have the right tribunal, it can work very, very well. But if you have a recalcitrant party and if you don't have the right tribunal, it can be a bit of a muddle and it can be a bit of a mess. And so it's one of these things that we're looking at very, very carefully, and also looking at just in the context of the caseload that we've got. So if I just think back to our 2024 statistics, I think we had an aggregate amount in dispute in excess of, I think it was almost 10 billion dirhams or 2.6 billion US dollars in dispute in the claims that were filed in request for arbitration. So that lowballs it. It doesn't take into consideration counterclaims and doesn't take into consideration reassessment of claims. But the lowest amount in dispute in that year was something like 25,000 dirhams or $7,000. It was particularly low. And then the highest amount was somewhere around about $1 billion or 3.6 billion dirhams. And so with an average amount in dispute somewhere around $10 million. So we are looking at the caseload from one year to the next and have been looking at 2022, 2023, 2024 with interest to see whether it is worthwhile increasing the threshold up. And I suspect we will probably do that. But it's so difficult to assess these sorts of processes and procedures so early on into their existence, because you just don't have the data to back up any gut feelings that you might have.
Well, it's such an interesting problem too, because parties, in my experience, particularly under other rules as well, that may have had earlier expedited rules, were so reluctant to engage in them until they realize that there are so many benefits to using an expedited process for lower dollar or lower value disputes, at which point they realize, oh, these are actually really, really useful. So it's some of it just takes experience, I think. But, that was also...
It's all about education, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And, in some respects, that's exactly what happened with emergency arbitration rules as well. And the history of those reflects that too. So let's talk quickly then about just the new emergency rules, because those are very important as well. Now, Article 2 of Appendix 2 includes an emergency arbitration provision. How quick is emergency arbitration under the 2022 rules or under the DIAC rules?
The short answer is quick, and arguably quicker than many other institutions. And I say that rather flippantly, but it does make me smile how quick it actually is set out in the rules. So we have just 1 day from the application coming in to actually appoint an emergency arbitrator, which is extremely, extremely tight. And in 2024, we received 5 applications. We received 5 in 2023, and I think we're about 5 so far this year as well. If we look back at the 2024 case statistics, all 5 of the applications were actually made without notice to the respondents. And in one of those cases, the arbitration court wasn't actually satisfied that it was reasonable to allow the emergency proceedings It wasn't satisfied that there was exceptional urgency and there was a real need for the appointment of an emergency arbitrator. But what we did in that case was we actually expedited the appointment of the tribunal and actually appointed a tribunal proper the following day in that case. And then in the other 4 cases, we successfully managed to appoint an emergency arbitrator within that 1-day limit. And I'm delighted to say that we've done that actually in all of the cases since this provision was implemented. And it needs a significant amount of administration to be able to do that. As soon as these applications come in, it's important to obviously get the money in for the sender's fees and the emergency arbitrator's fees and expenses. And so that obviously takes time, but we need to be working in parallel in terms of preparing lists of suitable candidates, approaching said candidates to clear conflicts and get their availability, and also then to approach the court to select from those candidates that have cleared conflicts and are available to ultimately take it on. And in terms of how those cases have been ultimately decided, I think in all 4 cases in 2024, the interim relief that was sought was actually granted, and those orders were made somewhere between 1 and 14 days. So I think the shortest period of time was a matter of hours, and the longest period of time was 14 days. And that we haven't seen anything much different from that this year. It's largely the same this year.
That's really interesting. There's 2 points I want to pick up on there just to follow up on. The first is, I think you mentioned applications being made without notice and that becoming a bit routine. In what circumstances does that arise? Because that is one of the more unique features. To my knowledge, I think it's only maybe perhaps the Swiss rules and perhaps one other institution that allow emergency applications without notice.
Yeah, so we've seen cases where parties have made these applications in circumstances where they're looking for urgent interim relief to arrest a vessel or a plane that's on the ground somewhere. And they have made case that making the respondent aware of the application in advance would actually put the whole application for interim relief. It would be detrimental to that entire application. And that has been the type of case that we have seen over the course of the last year to 18 months. They've all been of that nature. It's all about stopping a vessel, stopping a plane from taking off. And so in those types of circumstances, I think it probably has been appropriate to allow the applications to proceed on an ex-parte basis. Ultimately, the emergency arbitrator has the right to decide otherwise once appointed. And in a fair number of the cases, the emergency arbitrator has actually decided that it would be appropriate to involve the respondent and actually notify the respondent of the existence of the proceedings and get their take on it. But in the vast majority of the cases, they have actually proceeded to issue orders without notice, and then parties have gone off and sought to enforce them.
Interesting. Now let's pick up on that enforcement point for a second then too. Has there been an instance of an emergency award being enforced in the onshore Dubai courts?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen cases where those orders have been enforced domestically within the Dubai and wider courts in the UAE, but also internationally. And as I think I hinted to earlier on, I'm generally aware of planes and vessels being arrested overseas following the issuance of these orders by emergency arbitrators for interim relief, and parties going through a process of having those orders recognized and enforced in a Dubai court before then trying to enforce them overseas through reciprocal treaties, for example. So yeah, absolutely. We've seen that over the course of the last 18 months.
That's a really great development. That's a really great development. And I think the audience will appreciate how much anxiety that would take off the shoulders of a party that needed emergency relief, because that has been a problem around the globe, or an issue around the globe, I should say. So to hear that the Dubai courts are handling that well too, as well as internationally, is certainly a positive development. Let's shift gears then to just looking ahead, because as you mentioned earlier, the institution has now been around for 30 years, and you've been in the role for a while now. So if there's one thing that you would like to see the DIAC accomplish in the international arena in 2025, what would it be?
Great question. There are certain things that are certainty for us this year. So we've had a lot of projects on the go over the course of the last 2 years since I've been in this role specifically, and the reality was that what we had to do was we had to set a firm foundation for the institution moving forward in 2023. And there was a great deal of work done to build the right team, recruit the right people, put the right processes and procedures in place to work with the excellent arbitration court that we have. And then once we've done that, to take a step back and look at our processes or procedures or systems, the technology that we use, and really look internationally to what other institutions are doing, and also what some of the leading law firms internationally are doing to try and make improvements. And one of the most important, the most strategic things that we did in 2024 was partner up with Opus 2 to build a new case management system for the institution. And a number of our competitors have worked with Opus 2 and have launched in the last 6 months or so new case management systems using their secure and scalable technology. And so the biggest thing for us, I think, in 2025 that will be uncertainty is the launch of that case management system, which will make a big difference for all users of the centre's services. And that system is ready and can be launched tomorrow, but we're selfishly just holding it back a little bit as we are in the final stages of launching also a new website. And so we want the new case management system to go onto that website. And I think that will be the single biggest change in 2025 for users of the centre, a safe, secure place for them to electronically file their cases, to make payments to the centre, to exchange documents with their counterparties and arbitrators, to use our secure system for document review purposes. And I think the potential for systems like this in the future, when it comes to the overlay of AI and the potential that could provide to parties and arbitrators is huge. So I think that's probably going to be our single largest accomplishment in 2025, but there's still lots of other things.
That is a great development, and it really indicates how focused the center is on ease of use and efficiency. So really wonderful to hear, and certainly at the forefront of creating a great user experience, which is really important. And obviously, it sounds to me like there is so much more we could discuss. So I think what we should probably do is I'm going to commit you now to come back in 2026 to talk some more about these developments and to hear more about how, for instance, the launch of the website and the introduction of Opus 2 have turned out, because I'm sure it's going to be a great success with everyone so focused on it. But I think for now, let's conclude our discussion of the DIAC. I want to thank Robert Stephen for his invaluable insights, and I want to thank you, the audience, for listening. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you, Robert. And the audience should feel free to reach out to Bracewell about today's podcast with any questions you might have, as well as to Robert directly. And we look forward to having you tune in for future episodes in our Arbitration Acumen series. And we definitely look forward to having Robert back. He's a great guest, and the DIAC is really doing incredible things that I'm sure Robert's going to be able to tell us more about in the future. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Arbitration Acumen. We hope you found it insightful and informative, and we encourage you to share it with your colleagues if you did. You can reach out to any of our speakers by contacting them directly or by emailing arbitrationacumen@bracewell.com. We welcome any questions or suggestions you might have for future episodes. And please subscribe to our podcast channel to stay up to date with our latest content.